Hey everybody, welcome back to Sangoglin Guns. What we've got on the table here is actually a new acquisition. I haven't even fired this thing yet, but I've been wanting one for a while. It's a Swiss K31, carabiner model of 31. It's a straight pull rifle. These are reputed to be very accurate and just all around, just very, very well made guns. This was effective. I mean, there were some others, and there's plenty of YouTube channels that go like deep dive into the history of these, but these were really kind of the front line infantry rifle for the Swiss during World War II. As with most things Swiss, they're generally very carefully made, very high quality, and they're kind of overlooked as surplus firearms. I'm a big fan of surplus stuff, but you know, these don't really have the combat history and the panache of something like a K98 or a Grand or an AW3 or something like that. Anyway, you can still get these, and most of them are in very good condition. This one's actually, the metal is great, but the stock on this one is a little rough, especially down here at the bottom. You can get them in nicer shape than this, but as a lot of people say when you're buying an old military weapon, you buy the bore, you buy the metal, and that's kind of what I did here. I may work on the stock, I may leave it. It's part of the kind of history of the gun, which is an interesting side note as well. But anyway, I digress. Like I said, I haven't even fired this thing yet. One of the things that you'll see a lot when people talk about K31s, they talk about not just the inherent accuracy of the gun, but they talk a lot about how good the trigger is. And the trigger is, as designed, it's a fairly long pull, but it's a nice long pull to a wall to where a second stage is, and then a very crisp break after that. The issue I've had with this gun is ever since I got it almost a week ago now, the trigger just hasn't felt right. It hasn't been performing like a lot of the other videos that I've seen online. And I'll cut to some other videos here. So at first, the trigger was very, there's a term talking about motorcycle for it's called stiction. It's sort of a made-up word. Philosophically, all words are made up. We're not going to go there. It's like a combination between sticking and friction. It's like when you have two pieces of metal rubbing against each other. It kind of wants to grab. So I've got a little video of what it looked like when, actually, right after I got the rifle, broke it down, cleaned it, greased it, put it back together, and it started doing this. So after that, I decided, you know, I kind of had to tear back into this thing and figure out what was going on. There's a Facebook page. I think it's Swiss Rifle Collectors. There's also several forums. I'm lurking on the forums. I don't really post on the forums. I have a lot of forum activity already, and it's like a whole thing to add a whole other forum. Anyway, Facebook, for all its faults, Facebook does make access to knowledge pretty easy. Anyway, there's some very knowledgeable people on the forum, on the Facebook page, sorry, Swiss Rifle Collectors. They recommended that I take everything back apart, clean it, degrease it thoroughly, check for burrs, you know, in the action and the bolt assembly and everything, put it back together and see what happens. So I did that. Actually, the trigger got quite a bit better when I cleaned it and took all the lube off of everything, and then reassembled it into the gun. Dry fired it probably 12 or 15 times, and then it started doing that stiction thing again. Took the bolt back apart and realized that some of the grease that I had used the first time around, this stuff actually, this Birchwood KC Universal Gun Grease, some of that was still in the receiver and had made its way back onto the sears in the trigger, and it started doing the stiction thing again. So I cleaned it all off again, and but this time when I went to lube it, I used a different product. Somebody on the Facebook page recommended a Moly or molybdenum grease, and I happen to have some of this from working on BMW motorcycles. It's a high moly. It is like a paste grease. It's not a dry grease or anything, or a dry lubricant, I should say. So I put that on there, and the trigger improved massively. And I'll cut to a clip here to show you really how smooth the trigger was. And actually, I have, in that video, I have the action out of the stock, so you can actually see, as you pull the trigger, you can see the sear drop down and release the bolt here, because it's nice and smooth, but it acts like a single stage trigger. There's no, I know it's a little hard to see. Let me move it up a little bit closer here. But right here, this bevel right here, it actually contacts the bottom of the receiver. And then right there, you heard it. But I had to be very careful to do it. And then when it cams up, that's when it releases the firing pin. But so overall, that felt really good. The problem was I wasn't getting the second stage. It was just a smooth pull, 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 pull break. There was no wall or anything. I could, if I was extremely careful and pulled the trigger extremely slowly, I could kind of gradually get to a point where if I was pulling the trigger really with this part of my finger and kind of moving my whole wrist back, I could get into that notch right up against that wall and then break, and it was really nice. Problem is, that's how it should work all the time. So I posted that information. People advised I check a few other things. One theory was maybe the extractor wasn't all the way in the bolt head, and maybe the extractor was interfering with the action of the trigger. That doesn't seem to be the case, but I do think I've got it tracked down. So here's the bolt out of the rifle, and you'll notice also on the paper down here we have the firing pin spring. I've taken this out for a reason. So the bolt assembly, everything is in here except for the extractor, which doesn't make a difference, and the firing pin spring. The firing pin, or this is actually the cocking piece. The firing pin is keyed onto the end of this, kind of up in here. It's in there. Got our charging handle. All that is in here. So let me drop this into the gun, and I'll show you how the trigger works with it set up like this. All right. So right now it's sort of difficult the way I've got the camera set up here. So without the firing pin spring, I'm going to manually hold some tension on the end of the cocking piece here. And I know it's a weird angle, but I've only got so many hands and no camera help. So as I pull the trigger back right there, you probably saw it. Let me do it again. Olivia's running around upstairs, so it's a little loud. Let me see if I can do it where you can hear it. Right there. See? And I'm not pulling on the fire. I'm not pushing on the cocking piece with a whole lot of effort. Just kind of enough to keep it pushed forward. But it's a nice smooth pull back, and then it hits that wall. And then just a little bit more pressure, nice clean break, and the cocking piece drops. So that's how the trigger is supposed to work. If I pull the bolt out, drop the gun back on the table, go ahead and disassemble the bolt real quick. Oh, drop the parts. Firing pin is not the part you want to drop on the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and put the extractor back in. And like I said, I know there may be some doubters here, but the extractor makes no difference whether it's in or out. So pop that back in. I kind of tend to, I don't know if this is necessarily kosher or not, with a plastic handle, kind of give the extractor a few wraps to make sure it's seated down in there good. All right, so the bolt head back in the bolt sleeve, and I'm just making up terms for these. I don't really know if that's the correct term. So cocking piece here goes into the sleeve, and you want it in the fire position right there. And then we'll drop our firing pin spring down, and this is kind of where I need more hands. Oh, nope, I got it. And then the firing pin slides on, and that's all retained. You want to pull the cocking piece out so it's just like that, to give us the ability to assemble the bolt. Drop it in there, turn this around. You want to make sure these two slots are lined up and kind of have the slot facing that way. Take your charging handle, back it in, drop it down, and put the firing pin or the cocking piece back into the fire position. Now, this is what's interesting. when I put this back in the rifle now, make sure it's all the way in battery. Now, as I pull the trigger, there's no wall. It's just it's like a single stage trigger. Like that. Now, the interesting thing is if I put pressure on the cocking piece, and I do have to put a fair bit of pressure on it, but if I put pressure on the cocking piece, now I can pull the trigger. Oh, didn't get it that time. Usually this works pretty well. Now that I've got the camera rolling, of course it's not going to. Fair bit of pressure on the cocking piece. Damn. Hang on, let me go around to a different angle here. All right. Fair bit of pressure on it. Pull the trigger, pull the trigger, pull the trigger. Right there. Now it's in the second stage, up against the wall. Break. So something happens to this when I introduce the firing pin spring into this is when I start having issues. It's also worth noting, I'm told that this is not normal to have a gap here. Actually grab my feeler gauges real quick and we'll see how big that gap is. Sorry for that hold up. So with it cocked, that's a 25 thou or 0.635 millimeter gauge that drops right in there. I could stack some more very thin ones on top, but you know, there's some resistance or some drag. That is approximately a 25 thousandths gap, 0.635 millimeter gap between the back of the cocking sleeve and the receiver when the action's cocked and in battery. So just to demonstrate that this is fairly repeatable, let's take the bolt out. Some of the bolt. Take the firing pin spring off. This is where it gets a little tricky. So put the firing pin back on. And this time, just to demonstrate, I've got the extractor in the bolt head there. Very carefully put it back. Because right now there's nothing holding this together without the spring, so it's, you know, it can just like fall out. Put our safety lever / cocking piece back, drop our handle in. Oh, we want it there. All right. Hopefully I can get it back in here. Yep. All right, so now we're back in the rifle. And now you'll notice that that gap is gone. I mean, there's a tiny bit there, but it's really just kind of the plate itself. And now, if I maintain just moderate pressure on the cocking piece and go to pull the trigger, right there, I hit that wall right where I expect it, and I get a break. So I guess I'll order a new firing pin spring. I don't know. It's, part of me wants to say, well, maybe it's not putting enough pressure on the cocking piece and the firing pin, because, you know, when a few minutes ago when I had it around, I was pushing the fully assembled bolt with the spring in it. When I was putting a lot of force on the back with my hand, I could create the trigger action the way that it should be. But without the spring, it's very easy. So I think this might be the culprit. Don't know why, but I suspect that's what it is. So yeah, stay tuned. Hopefully I'll have an update for you and let you know how this goes. You know, sometimes you run into stuff like this on old Milsurp rifles, and you know, not everybody has a gunsmith in their backyard. I know I don't. Well, I live in a very small town in rural Appalachia. There is one gunsmith, but if you take him anything besides like a Remington 870 or like a Remington 700, any of the kind of hunting rifles, or like a 1911, he's kind of out of his depth. I actually called him up and asked him. He's a good guy. He's older. He doesn't really do the milsurp thing unless it's a Garand or an Alt 3 Springfield. And I was asking him if he had any experience with the K31, and he kind of hemmed and hawed for a minute, and then he said, "Oh, what?" So yeah, I mean, I respect his experience and everything, but with this particular platform, it seems that I know just about as much as he does, which isn't much. So hopefully we can get that straightened out.